Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third The Unordinary Bible Study session, which is a partnership project that I threw together as an intern involved in the Active Inference Institute. And essentially, many of us involved in the Active Inference Institute are affiliated in some capacity and also involved in largely furthering AI and machine learning research initiatives and looking into community building based projects and entrepreneurial efforts and philanthropic efforts. So we're trying to do everything in terms of getting involved in getting the right kind of innovations inspired, and even research and technology fronts, really trying to make a difference for our communities. So, uh, active inference, for those of you who are unfamiliar with, has much to do with investigating the utility and development of autonomous systems, or really systems that we're trying to automate, better automate certain mundane tasks that we do, and trying to offload um, multiplicities of tasks, and how the intricacies of those tasks, in terms of like those of us who work in the tech industry, or those of us who are into writing or do really technical analytical things with the use of technology, the arena of active inference, with the focus of understanding the autonomy of systems in terms of what they're capable of, their limitations, and how much, like what kind of load balancing and capacities the systems can have, to in which we can extend our capacities to better utilize technology, and not as a means to exploit our use of resources in our environment, but to complement, to actually use technology to symbiotically establish better cohesion with the world around us. So I think so. There's a lot of talking points I could go to around that, and also in regards to understanding improving scientific methodological insights, and understanding the abstractions of modeling systems in terms of their instantaneous behavior, because active inference uh, uh, is very focused on not only, you know, the how we perceive the world around us and react to the world around us. So a lot of active inference research is especially inspired in understanding human behavior, but most importantly, the intersections between human behavior and developing and utilizing technology as a means to complement and symbiotically establish a way we interact and engage with the world around us, rather than exploit ourselves in the world around us. So that's really important. And in addition to that, regarding what this has to do with Bible study. So this is the Unordinary Bible Study. So we take an unordinary approach to a Bible study, in the sense of doing contemporary perspective exploration. So getting a lot into philosophy, and talking about transdisciplinary, um, how can we have a transdisciplinary conversation, and a conversation about spirituality, and how that is meaningful to the world around us, and how we impact the world around us. So I like to say that science and theology can get along, in the sense that especially considering what we can utilize active inference for, is to establish boundaries, like to understand um, where we are uncertain in utilizing scientific methodology and where approaches of how we engage with problems in the world around us are undecidable. And so the boundary, that boundary, that edge of uncertainty and undecidability, and having the optimism on top of that, to hope that we can explore those edge parameters, I'd like to call them, more fruitfully and appreciably. I think that's what really motivates having this kind of dialogue. And it's not just interfaith based dialogue that I think this is really motivating here and insightful for here, where we consider different people of different spiritual backgrounds and different belief system, like they come from a different culture, and we should respect that and have a dialogue about how can we take different lenses from different walks of life and have a mutual understanding that is important for this symbiotic coherence of how we can better engage with the world around us and meaningfully live meaningful lives and doing the right thing. I guess that sounds very hippie like or what have you, but it also regarding these Bible studies in terms of like how active inferences has anything to do with Bible study is how um, we can explore the principles of Christianity, not just going through the scripture, but I don't think anybody necessarily has to be a Christian to get insight and motivation in their lives in terms of you know finding meaning if they feel they're struggling with themselves in terms of having an existential crisis of sorts. But I really hope that this kind of discussion really motivates people to be inspired to do more for themselves and their community. And it's not just about me, it's not just about you, it's about the world around us and how we engage with it, right? And again, like thinking about active inference has much to do with, the moments of perceiving and acting, and then like taking into account over time how that perceiving and acting, you know, how that amalgamates and the ebbs and flows of how we hold ourselves accountable, and doing what we think is what we honestly feel is the right thing, and being mindful of that. And not just active inference is important here, but also considering for a lot of people really in the philosophy would call process theory is just understanding that how things interact with each other and just how we understand how the world is unraveling. Uh, from a personal and an interpersonal point of view, right? It's not just thinking about the science of it, but also about the subject. It's not about the object, but the subject. So that I think that's a good lead into introducing what these sessions are about, and to motivate talking about God. I always pitch my model of the Holy Trinity, which has to do with thinking about the Father as the unravelings of like how we as humans, the history of our interactions, for better or worse. The Son being setting the best example, in the sense of being honest with ourselves and making decisions conscientiously, and and setting an example in a way that um, is not selfish, or but also is mindful and is and this gets to like the Christian principles of acting in unconditional love towards the world around us and each other, and also um, being I don't want to say clever, but really using our capacity to reason as humans. Like we have this capacity to abstract the world around us, and thinking about our the consequences of our actions and how they unravel, right? And then the sun represents the in the moment carrying out of our perceptions and actions and keeping track of, how we're perceiving and acting in correspondence to being mindful. So yeah, so let's see what you guys have to say about all that, and we'll go from there. I have a number of Bible verses to go through, but I want to see where things go before I get there, and I really want to talk about what is truth, like, and not in respect to ultimate truth, but really relational truth. I want to investigate that. Um, but I want to see where discussion goes, and we'll lead into from there. Uh, but yeah, what do you guys have to say?
I mean, you asked a good question. You're talking about what is truth. Do you have a definition that you'd like to go start with?
So I think that you guys are familiar with the definition of an agent from the lens of psychology and sociology. I guess in a sense, an agent is, for instance, we consider us to be agents. We have the capacity to make decisions, and we really want to optimize those decisions. And the way we optimize those decisions is um, the fact that we have a conscience where we can, not necessarily a cold calculation. I don't think all these calculations are deterministic. There's a lot of non-determinism and indeterminism going on there. Um, Indeterminism meaning, when we deal with anxiety and we don't know quite what to do, but we make a decision based on our best judgments and knowledge in the moment and over time. So that's what I mean by indeterminism. And then non-deterministic, meaning that there are multiple possibilities in which perceptions can transition into action. So we can have thoughts, but we may think we might play out an action in our head. That doesn't mean the action will actually happen. So that also complicates how we conduct our conscience. But in relation to that, I would say, we're trying to be honest and mindful of how we conduct ourselves in in a way that I'm doing what I can to optimize my fitness, but also not putting your fitness in jeopardy, right? So this becomes like a multi-dimensional prisoner's dilemma because we're all existentially bound to an ecosystem where we kind of have to diplomatically cooperate with each other for the best outcomes. Um, but I think the truth has much to do with the novelty exploration of facilitating this and being able to appreciate each other because we all have this same capacity of having a conscience and this free will, well, degrees of free will based on nature and nurture dynamics. Nature being the physiologically we are born with into the world, and nurture being the training, like if you think of pre-training a machine learning algorithm or if you pre-training an AI system, you pre-train humans, from an early age, right? And then like they have a model, they have a moral model, and then they match that moral model to their reasoning. So there's I like to call the Daniel Kahneman system one and system two, and then you match that with the moral um, Jonathan Haidt's The Rider and the Elephant. The rider being um, kind of trying to guide the reasoning, but the elephant being the visceral, in the moment, reacting to the world around you. But I would say the truth is, in a sense, relational, not ultimate, um, in respect to that. But before I go on a tangent there, hopefully that makes sense, right? Because it's based on my experiences and how I relate my experiences to you, and how like I carry myself with respect to everybody else, and I'm aligning my truth with other people's truth. So you have this consensus, right? You have this truth, you have a truth alignment, right? The alignment problem is really a problem with humans aligning their moral compass, not really how we build systems, but that's the irony of it. Anyway, I'll stop going on a tangent.
No, no. Well, I'm quite interested in the topic only because when we talk about truth, and you mentioned it too, there is the truth that we can consider is ultimate, it's undeniable, but also there's the truth where we can say it's different. So, for example, I can ask you what time it is where you are, and you'll give me a time, and I'll give you a different time, which is different for me. But let's say, as Christians, we were to ask if God is real, I think some people will say undeniably, he is. So which truth are you referring to? Are you referring to the truth where I have more say based on me as the agent, or the truth where, regardless of how I feel, it is what it is?
I'll interject there. Um, what would you respond to people that say from their own experience they don't think God is real? So, like the ultimate statement you're professing, someone else does not agree with that being an ultimate truth statement.
What would I say?
Like, how would you bridge the gap of understanding between two people's conception of an ultimate truth? And well, yeah,
No, I like the question. It actually depends on the ground that me and that person is standing on. So if it's somebody who where we can let's say they believe that there is a Satan, for example, but they don't believe in a God. There's something else I'll say to that person as opposed to somebody who simply does not believe in a higher power. Um,
right. But the point is that I guess you would try to convince them, right? You would
true.
try to convince them of your truth, and they would try to convince you of their truth, right? Um,
Yes.
but the very basis for there being an argument belies the claim that there is an ultimate truth that all people can easily and simply understand and discover, right? And that's sort of the dilemma of philosophy for 3,000, 4,000 years. The idea of an ultimate order, an idea of an ultimate truth, if there is such a thing, which I would say all of us believe that there is, there are two conceptions of how we arrive there, two at least modern conceptions, or there's three, but I'll say the two main ones. One is philosophy, questioning, obtaining knowledge empirically of the world. Right? They say philosophy begins with a question, and then there's theology, which begins with an answer through revelation. But then we encounter the issue of people having their own experiences of revelation. And then we can get into a dialogue about, well, what is revelation? Is revelation true or this and that? But this sort of is at the heart of what Jesse's talking about is how do we actually bridge the gap of understanding between these various groups and these various people that come from different cultures, different areas of origin, different cultural understanding of things, different even languages to describe certain things. Um, right? And then the answer that is developing, that's it's very difficult to really articulate and to explain because it is very difficult to give a straight answer to what is the objective ultimate truth without falling into sort of some form of dogmatism. And I'm all not all for, but I used to be all for dogmatism. Um, but I would say the difficulty, the answer there is something relational, where we discover it through a wide branch of relations, a nexus of interactions. But yeah, I guess I'll pose the same question once again to see your thoughts on that. Right, the very basis for an argument there. How do you then make the claim for the ultimate truth?
A claim for it, or why would I say that God is?
Well, no, I'm not even going into your argument. I'm saying the basic fact that um, that you said there's two types of truths, right?
Yes.
And then type one is relational, right? Where, someone is in a different time zone, someone is in a different sort of area, this and that. But then you say there's an ultimate truth. Um,
Yes.
I'm trying to say that, well, how do we unify that ultimate truth? For example, you say you can make an argument for why God is real, but the very idea that that is an ultimate truth is negated by the fact that somebody else can make an argument or believe that there is no God and make an argument for that, right? Am I making any sense there? I don't know.
No, I understand what you're saying. I don't know if it negates it though, because I can say 2 + 2 = 4, and somebody can say that's not true, but that doesn't make their idea right.
That's true. That's true. But logic itself is built on presuppositions, right? Um, and so it, I do agree with you there. I really do. But it's difficult because uh, when we get into something like God, and also this is a thing too. You say 2 + 2 is 4. Yeah, we can agree with that. We can say, well, this is a dog, or this is a chair, this is a rock. We can make these empirically verifiable claims based on a system of logic. But how do we make a claim about, you know, the thing that we actually really disagree on, which is moral claims, right? Where someone would say, well, this is right, you know, and then someone would say, well, this is wrong. Um, how would you mediate that? How do you get to the ultimate truth there?
Something that I've learned back in college, I studied philosophy, and there are two types of conversations people have. There's the I want to prove to you that I'm right, and there's the hey, listen, I don't understand the world well, and I'm sure you don't understand it, entirely as well. However, we can try to see the different aspects that we do understand, present those things so we can come to a common truth. And so that's what I would do.
100%. So the common truth is shared relatively, right? It's a
Yes.
relational thing. So even that ultimate truth that you were making for in there earlier, that's still bound by the criteria of your first truth, the relational aspect. Right? Because the idea of someone's truth being different based on where they're at, right? That's the common ground of people living in France is that time zone. So they will agree on the truth that this is the time, right? And so then you try to find that common ground, but then that's pretty much articulating that the idea of that truth is relational rather than non-relational. Because non-relational would be something like outside of that, outside of all of that. Um, but I don't actually have an answer to this question, which is why, I maybe I should have prefaced the question with that because I don't have an answer.
No, no.
Um,
Yeah, there's
uh,
if I may jump in, I've been looking at some verses. The, I'm not assuming you guys know any by heart, but I think a popular one is John 14:6.
What does it
But
say?
it says, Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But I find First Timothy 2:4, which says, who will have all men to be saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. I find that to be a bit more interesting. But I think, truth is relational in the sense that um I think that and there's this I don't are you guys familiar with George Lakoff? I started reading this book called Where Mathematics Comes From, and it seems like there's an argument to be made that humans aren't the only species or the only types of agents out there that can do some innate level of abstraction in terms of mathematics, like being able to add and subtract and multiply, like doing like basic arithmetic, but not really being able to really get abstract about mathematics. But it's still interesting that this there's an innate ability for many species to reason in this way. So I think that on the one hand, we have these like visceral feelings of emotions, like that we're taking in the stimuli around us. But on the other hand, like this like visceral feeling also uh, in a way regulates our reasoning, like how we evaluate decisions. Like we basically have these like we have like these decision weight mechanisms, right? So there's some kind of there's these operations going on that allow like we're making certain types of calculations, not the way computers make calculations. Those would be binary operations, but like that's not even a whole, that's like if you think about how classical interactions work in the physical sense, like that's like really just a subset of like, okay, look, we're going to make a circuit out of like electrical components. And this circuit will be able to do some sort of operations. But um, I think the truth has much to do with how we are able to do like these sort of operational behaviors, like how we make evaluations on our environment. But I think one big issue is how much most of humanity takes knowledge for granted, as if it's like, the knowledge is absolute. It won't change. It won't shift around. Like, but it's relational. Like the knowledge is relational based on like the exploratory trial and error behavior that all agents have, like all types of life have. We just happen to have like we just were able to evolve in a way that really harnesses this capacity to transfer knowledge from generation to generation by recorded history. But so because we're able to do that because of the way we harness language, and I hope more people get interested in studying linguistics, because I think like one of the big frontiers that we really have to crack in terms of like really understanding how to innovate in terms of thinking and progressing society is like we need to have a better understanding of what we can do with understanding language and understanding that like evaluating making truth table kind of evaluations, so to speak, right? Like how we categorize things, like the very first principles of like this relational truth is that we have these visceral experiences. Like I'm experiencing sensations, and those sensations are like emotional feelings. Like they generalize to emotional feelings, and those have weights on like, whether I'm doing something on autopilot or I have to think. And if something's hard, if like something is challenging for me to think about, it's not going to be a 1 + 1 = 2 trivial problem there. It's like, okay, what are these emotions like? What is the distribution of these emotions as decision weights, and how does that impact, my decision making of, okay, this is the decision I'm going to make. And before I make that decision, there's a non-deterministic set of possibilities, that can happen, that can unravel, and you kind of have a chain, like a cause, in physics. There's this area called causal set theory. So Faye Docker is a big player. She's a big deal in this arena, and Stephen Wolfram, Wolfram Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha, the computation engine. So they're uh, trying to understand, um, interactions that we can't even program into computers yet, but we can come up with formulas, and then that helps us better understand what kind of decision making operations are happening here from not a classical level, but we're thinking about not even quantum logic operations, because this has to do with affective processing, right? Because this visceral the visceral feeling, um, of the emotions, right? Like this is different. This is a different type of logic system. It's not the same, like being able to weigh our emotions and make decisions is like multi-parameter based, right? You have multiple modes interacting with each other in which we make decisions. So this is not even just hyperbolic space. These are not just hyperbolic operations. Um, I like to call metabolic operations, right? Like we're agents, we have a metabolism in like the literal sense of like how we break food down and the actual sense of top-down cognitive functioning, like our psych, like how our psyche works and what we're exposed to, and then how we develop a world model, so to speak, in a belief system based on that the consistency of that world model. But anyway, I talked a bit long enough there, but yeah.
Well, I think from what you just said, it made one thing clear at least. I think we still agree that there is somewhat of an ultimate truth. We still agree there is somewhat of a situational truth, like what's true for me may not be true for you, and we have
Mhm.
to look at each other's side. But you just said something that revealed to me that there is a third truth. There is the truth where we both may believe this thing is true because that's the knowledge we have right now, and tomorrow something happens and we realize we're both wrong.
Hmm. What do you call that?
Contextual truth, maybe?
It could be contextual. I like the term, but I think it might be something different. I haven't really figured that out yet because, so let's say we first believe you.
Contingent truth,
Okay,
perhaps.
I'd take that
Can you
because
repeat that one?
contingent truth.
Contingent, you
So
say?
it sort of is based on what we know for now, right? So there's a time when we believe perhaps we could not fly, and then we now have the ability to fly. So that truth changes.
Hmm.
So if we're having a conversation, I
I,
guess one thing we could say is every truth at the beginning perhaps can be relational based on my own experience. Then it can switch to being contingent. And from us determining or agreeing, I suppose, we then say, you know what, this is true for all. Or we can overgeneralize that it is. And we have to retest it again to figure out if that's actually the truth.
so yeah, so what's the failsafe on the contingent truth? Um, because yeah, what's the failsafe on the ultimate truth not just being a contingent truth?
It being something that's not currently proven wrong.
But does that make it contingent on the basis of future knowledge? Perhaps changing what we believe now?
I think some truths, honestly, are the ultimate truth. Even if we've asked, I think, therefore I am, I still believe that I am a person. I still believe that I exist. I still believe that I am having a conversation with you rather than
Right?
just a.
Every single one of those statements was I believe.
No, 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 no. I know, but
I'm playing
I.
devil's advocate. I've been
No,
playing
no, I
devil's
know, I
advocate.
know.
I know.
I agree because it forces us to really think deeper. But I am having a conversation with you, you know?
Yeah,
And so that's the truth. I don't think, um, and once this video is posted online, people will say that we did have a conversation.
that's
So
true. Yeah,
yeah, that's true.
that's true. Yeah, I'm playing. I'll share like a couple cents here. I'm playing the devil's advocate because it appears to me that the claim that we've arrived at in modernity, which is sort of, I think, my personal efforts as a pushback against this. I think Jesse's efforts are a pushback against this too, is that there's an overemphasis on a postmodern way of viewing the world. And so it's sort of like the motto of the postmodern view is that there is no truth, and that is the truth. Um, right. And yeah, the only truth is that there is no truth. And if we hold that to be true, well, it's sort of paradoxical. How can that be? But the original intent of the view is sort of we should question everything, and that's a good sort of that's a good thing, I think, to be skeptical, to question, to learn. But the consequence, I think, has been a inverse form of dogmatism that criticizes anything that even attempts to boundarize or because the thing is even if we're just talking about on a basic layer, if I want to describe a religion, say I want to describe Christianity, and I want to say, well, this is what Christianity is. Um, I can't do that really. Like from a postmodern academic intellectual perspective, it's very difficult And the reason is because if I boundarize it, then I give it an absolute, and I give it an absolute sort of identity. And then I restrict the possibilities and I restrict these other things. Um, and I sort of have encountered this problem myself really, really often actually, because I was doing some stuff. I was like doing a lot of street talking with people, with a lot of Jewish people about Judaism, about these concepts. And what realized was that the more secular a person was, the more hesitant they were to even describe Judaism as anything categorical. But the more religious or traditional they were, the more readily they described Judaism through a traditional absolute lens. And so my view is always that there should be a balance because the truth is, well, well, what I think is that there is a reciprocal relationship between the two elements, that the subjective pierces into the objective and the objective pierces into the subjective, and there's that reciprocal relationship, the microcosm, the macrocosm, the particular and the universal, right? And this is really what a lot of the idea of I think Jesus represents in a very Gnostic, even Kabbalistic, mystical sense, is that it's a union of opposites, right? Man and God, particular, universal, beginning and end. Uh, um, what are some other ones? Death and life, right? And so those union of opposites sort of seem to represent that, we have this rational frame of viewing the world. The rational frame tells us that there are things that are incompatible, right? Up and down are not compatible. Left and right are not compatible. God and man are not compatible. These are rational opposites. Yet, sort of the message we obtain from the gospel, at the very least, is that no, that's not necessarily true. That the highest representation of spirituality is a union of the opposites. And then that sort of perspective gives us a completely different model or framework of viewing truth, because then the entire way that we've been rationally viewing truth kind of collapses on its head. Um, this is where I think a lot of uh, this is where Carl Jung, this is really what his entire perspective, right? Because he had this whole idea of an unconsciousness, a collective unconsciousness, and both a collective and individual unconsciousness that was rooted in something irrational that could not be known in a rational sense, but that was interrelational or reciprocal with the conscious. Um, so long story short, there, I think that you know the reason it's so difficult to have this sort of conversation is because we're so rooted in a rationalistic way of viewing everything. And one of the main things that we obtain from the gospel is that, well, wait a second, none of this really seems rational, right? Even beyond the miracles, from a more like rationalistic sense, even like the idea of God is man or man is God. These two ideas, this sort of union of these rationally antagonistic or oppositional ideas, that doesn't seem possible. Yet that entire narrative, that entire way of viewing things is sort of flipped on its head. And so this is where I think the union of the science or the philosophy and theology is really, really beautiful. And I think that's really what um, the modern effort should be oriented towards. And I think there has been a bit of a misstep with the postmodern perspective. But I don't know, does that make any sense? Have you guys ever read about this conception of like a unity of opposites in mysticism or Gnosticism or Kabbalah or um, psychology, actually, alchemy? It
I
might seem
found
something
some.
more.
Sorry about that.
No, go
I was
ahead.
about to say I found about five pretty interesting Bible scriptures that can build on this sense of relational truth. But I didn't know if there was something you were sharing that.
That was it. That was it. That was what I was
Okay,
sharing.
all
That
right.
the overly rationalistic perspective, the over like logicization of truth claims in general, uh, is in and of itself a fallacy that I think the Gospels, from a certain reading, demonstrate to us.
Yeah, I think the book of Matthew is really interesting. So right here, Matthew 7:13-14 says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And by it, those who enter by it are many, for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And let's see. Hebrews 2:14 says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil." Romans 3, verse 20 says, "For by the works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin." And let's see. And this one's a little bit more simplistic, but Matthew 28:19 says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." So thinking about how that relates to the cognitive model that I brought up, you could see that metaphysical relation there and getting that to that relational truth, which I think if we um, I'm a big fan of Lisa Barrett was it Lisa, is it Lisa Feldman? Lisa Barrett Feldman. I mix up her middle name and last name sometimes, but she does a lot of good research. She's a cognitive psychologist, does a lot of research on emotions, and she talks about um, this idea of consensus, where, like I said, we all experience reality in a certain way, and then we don't necessarily have a clash of beliefs, but we optimize, okay, what on average are we experiencing, and how can we mitigate our experiences, and how and optimize our interactions with each other. So that's what consensus really has to do with this exploration of truth. And in a sense, like if we're looking at this from a um, uh, experience from the lens of empiricism, especially how we experience the world and how that impacts scientific methodology. And a lot of philosophical uh, got let's see, Peter Godfrey. What's her name? What's his name? There's this philosophy of science book that I'm forgetting his last name, but his name is his first name's Peter, the author. But uh, basically, a lot of the problems of philosophy of science is like how we experience the world around us, and then like what we make of like what's really happening, as opposed to the measuring what's happening and then just adapting based on, this instrumentalism, so to speak. So we make tools out of like how we experience the world around us and manipulate our environment. So gets into all that. But consensus really has much to do with, okay, what are we experiencing on average, and mitigating those experiences and optimizing on that. And I think combining that with being mindful and appreciating the world around us, and the focus on symbiotic cohesiveness, and this awareness of being a part of this big ecosystem we're embedded in. Like, I think this gets to like the aspects of God we could talk about, because truly understanding God, that gets us to the God of the gaps argument, and then we try and we try to containerize what God is, and then we keep finding out there's more aspects of what it means to act in conduct ourselves in a sacred manner, or so to speak. So we end up, like, when we try and prove that God exists, it ends up being like, well, how do we live an honest life? And then we have that conversation, and we realize it's all about how we're conducting ourselves in relation to each other. So this relational realism then is relating the personal to the interpersonal. So you go from non-duality to duality here. Well, that's one way of thinking of duality and non-duality, like this relationalism of the personal to interpersonal. But this, you know, we think of God, especially from a Christian principle sense. And I'm not calling myself a Christian per se. I'm heavily inspired and motivated by Christian thinking and going through the Bible. So I go to my local church's Bible study and all that. But I'd be careful to call myself a Christian, especially since I'm kind of new to this sort of exploration and motivated to do these Bible studies. So I approach this in a way of humiliation and honesty with myself, having these discussions, despite like what knowledge I present. It's like I'm a man of humility and trying to be humble. I'm no saint, but that's the way I approach this dialogue. But I think that's a good spin I have for this relational truth, so to speak. Thinking about consensus from Lisa Barrett Feldman's point of view.
Mm. Well, that's interesting. I'm going to play devil's advocate again, um, right? Because the consensus argument, that's sort of, if we look at periods in human history, there's been a consensus on things that today we deem to be immoral or wrong. Yet there was a consensus on those things. So, would the consensus argument require that everyone agrees or just the majority agrees?
Is there
Um,
one thing in the world that we all agree on 100%?
Doesn't seem like it, no. Well,
we
maybe.
it's
Yeah,
a
well, actually,
it's
it's plenty
a
of things.
1 second here. It is. I don't want to call it a game of averages. You end up with a distribution of beliefs. You take the average of that distribution,
Hmm.
and basically taking that average equates to how we as agents align our truth values with each other, and we compromise. There might be things we disagree on, but it might not be life or death, or like, oh, I don't like you because you think differently about, I don't know, you don't like this genre of music or whatever. Like, there's all bunch of things we can agree or disagree on, like or dislike. What we imagine in our heads to be true or false can vary. I mean, some people can take the Bible literally. I don't. Um, but I
Well,
feel like I can
how,
experience what the disciples go through in this really interesting meta. Kevin made a really good point uh the last session that you two weren't involved in. It's like, well, it's interesting how in some of these narratives that the characters basically write themselves, and it's like you have the meta characterization of the character where you place yourself uh in the shoes of Peter or whichever disciple you relate most to. But I'm sorry, I want to give you a chance to talk, but maybe you relate to what I'm saying.
yeah, I personally do. I think that that's part of what the idea of like the initiation into the mystery is, right? Right, imagining yourself in that position, but then also seeing how plenty of times over and over again you see the repetition of those biblical events in your own life. And so then you see this sort of mythology that you're living in relation to this grand mythology of salvation. Then you see, well, wait a second. I mean, that's a very profound, you might even call that a mystical experience. That's what the
Mhm.
sort of mysteries I think are meant to be. But there is like, I'm going to play devil's advocate just because like I agree with you, but I want to be, these are the sort of arguments that I've been having, and I want to sort of investigate them more from different perspectives. If, I come up to you and I say, well, I'm a literalist. And I go to that verse in John, there is no way to the Father except through me. And I say, well, if you're not if you don't believe in this specifically, you're going to hell. How do you even generate right? Because then you get into a very difficult element because then you might say, oh, okay, well, you can either take like the Catholic perspective and say, well, we're going to follow the way that the saints and scholars of the scripture have sort of delineated these ideas across time. Or you can say, well, we're going to go sola scriptura and we're going to go from like a more Protestant direction. But then there's all these disagreements constantly emerging. Right? It seems like that's sort of a common theme, especially here in America, where there's a vast disagreement. I was just in like a Discord where two people had a very strong argument with each other. One of them, an older man that has been part of the church, has religious studies degrees and all these other things, getting to a very difficult argument with another kid who's a convert, and they had this disagreement about dogma, about the ideas of the church and the institution, and all these other ideas, and there was sort of a falling out at the end. That was sort of tragic to see, but these sort of things are happening. And so for me, like personally, if I stop playing devil's advocate, the way I respond is that, well, there are these spiritual experiences, and there's this unifying idea beneath everything that connects us, and it sort of seems non-dual. Um, and then the more that we experience the duality, the more that we're going to say, well, this is this and this is that. The more that we're rooted in the duality, the more we'll fall into these dogma traps, and the more that we'll be unable to come to a common consensus. But the more that we exist in that non-duality, the more that we're able to find a common ground. But the precondition for the non-duality is sort of letting go of the rationality a little bit, because the rationality is rooted in the duality. I don't know if that makes any sense. And what I mean is that, okay, well, the duality would say that there's a good and there's an evil. And rationality would tell us that there are things that are explicitly good and the things that are explicitly evil. But the non-duality would tell us, well, there is an interlap. Not necessarily an interlap, but more so that the dogmatic idea of the two is not as such. I'm trying to think of a scripture that sort of because I just had one in my head, but let me see. I think I had one here.
What was that verse that you said about through Christ being the only way? Like one
Yeah,
thing
there
I
is no
will
way to the
say, one thing I will say is like I said, I don't think there's enough linguists like actually studying the Bible. So
exactly, exactly.
there's a lot of different portions of scripture that mean the same thing. So that Bible verse you said, I would say, well, basically that's the same thing that first what I mentioned, First Timothy 2:4, which says, "Who will have all men to be saved and to come on unto the truth." Sorry, come unto the knowledge of the truth. I believe that's Timothy, First Timothy 2:4. Let me just double check.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, like I had a friend, and we're still very close friends, and he would always have these arguments with a lot of Catholics about, well, what did
Yeah.
Jesus mean when he said that? What did he mean when he said that specifically? Right? How can we know what he meant? And there is a contextual idea there, right? Right. When Pilate asks Jesus, well, are you the king of the Jews? And what does he respond with? I forget. It's what exactly is the line? Let me go to the
Yeah, like I was saying, like I think there's certain verses that are lesser intuitive but easier. They're less intuitive but easier for other people to comprehend, but they'll take it too literally, and then you just say, well, there's another verse that is a little bit loose in the ambiguity here, but then it's relational instead of being a bit contrived and being non-relational, because I don't
yeah.
think rationality is the problem here. It's the non-relationalism. It's when there's like, okay, is there a compromise here in our truth, in our beliefs, to a point where we can't, that there's a hostile interaction rather than a complementary cooperative interaction, right? So it's like, okay, well, what does this verse really mean? And is there another verse, maybe in another book, that we could just say, okay, this basically means this, but it's less contrived. It's not
Right,
that
but
it's
then
less
but then
appreciative.
but then you get into a problem of authority, you know? Right? So but then it's like that's an argument for like the Catholic Church, I would say. Because then you would say, well,
Hmm.
right? Because then all of this scripture, all of this has been cross-textualized, all these other things, and there has been given a universalistic understanding of what is truly meant by the scripture. But then you would say, well, you know what? I think this is what is truly meant by the scripture. Then you get into an authority problem. Who who
Hmm.
is who is worthy of saying what is the actual interpretation, right? And so how does the Catholic Church overcome this? Well, they say that um, there's a line of apostolic succession, right? The key, like the Vatican is literally the shape of a keyhole, right? And the key is given to Paul. I believe it's Paul, right? And so that's how that sort of problem of authority and hierarchy is resolved. But I mean, for many, that doesn't seem sufficient, um, right? Because then you have a problem with people that have modern ideas of morality, and they'll say, well, you know what, the way the church says this, I don't agree with that. I'm going to go this other way. Well, then how do you, what is the thread? What is the thread? And so that's what I'm saying. The rationality is part of the problem, right? Because the rationality would tell us, well, it would go into the authority problem, it would go into the hierarchical problem, it would go into the interpretations problem, the linguistics problem, and it would tell us that there is an ultimate, if there is only one specific way, and everyone must align with that way. Everyone must, right? But then the plurality, right? Because if we say there's a plurality, that becomes more non-rational. Um,
Well, it's
and
not that
so
it becomes more non-rational. I think like there's a problem with like how like public access to like how we understand knowledge and information and like make those connections in terms of like, okay, how are we abstracting, how are we picking apart at the information and making sense of it, not only for ourselves, but like in a
yeah,
way that's consistent. So and and in mathematics, you have different types of logic systems. You have non-classical logic systems and you have classical logic systems. And unfortunately, like our economy and much like most of the computers we use, we are limited to binary operations, right? So that's like not even all of classical Newtonian physics. That's like a subset of like how we could take electrical circuit architectures that we use to build computers and like be able to build these systems and use them to, but then there's this problem of then taking that literally and extending that, okay, well, we're going to have these one-dimensional currency systems where we everything has a price tag, like to hell with the impact of supply and demand, right? It's like, okay, efficiency, but oh, nobody has any idea of resiliency at that point, right? So like
right.
we have this
So then it's the presuppositions on the system. It's like, what are we trying to maximize,
yeah.
right? And then, so, but who determines the presuppositions, right? Because they can't be rationally arrived at. They're rationally built upon. But it's a faith statement. It's a faith presupposition, an axiom
Hmm.
that develop. And so, like, we go to Gödel, we go to the incompleteness theorems, we go to all these mathematical dilemmas, and then it's like, well, wait a
Yeah.
second. That's where you go back to the beginning, and it's like, oh, we're at the postmodern problem, and now we're at the pure relativism. Is there even a way of developing a common ground? Is that even a fallacy of our? Is that just hubris of
Hmm.
our modern universalist desire to unite humanity? Is it? I mean, that's a genuine, serious question. That's what we're grappling with. I think that's what the world is grappling with at the moment. That's what I think the philosophical, religious, spiritual dilemma is how do we connect people?
Yeah.
Connect, how do we bridge gaps that seem unbridgeable,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. One thing I will
And that's why
say,
I was playing devil's advocate from the
mhm.
start, because this I feel like this trajectory that we've walked, that's like the trajectory of modern philosophy.
Yeah,
Maybe.
one thing I'll definitely say is that you mentioned a lot about the problems with the postmodern takes. And I think postmodernism has been around for a while since people have been making science fiction novels and stories and predictions about the future. Ever since people have been doing that, you've had postmodernism, right?
You
It's
could say
kind of like
postmodernism started with like, even Gnosticism, right?
making
And like
these
the
egocentric predictions about where humanity is going to go without really honestly evaluating not just your own thoughts about that, but like actually rationally being honest. Well, maybe they
well,
were at the time like honest about, but it was the mental framing that was the issue because I think it's not about the egocentrism or the centrism per se, but it's our relation with like as a species in relation to the ecosystem we're a part of. But we're like the problem with postmodernism is we're not thinking about that. We're just thinking about us. And then we're thinking about
hmm.
how our actions are going to play out in the future, but not really paying much attention to the repercussions and the mindfulness aspect and the appreciability aspect. So then when a lot of philosophers around the time Nietzsche came around, I think is really when we see, well, I would say meta-modernism has been around maybe since Socrates, right? Like
Yeah.
thinking really about, wait, how do I, you know,
Narrative.
how do like the narr how do I abstract out reality as an individual and relate back to the world around me, right? So this idea of like meta-modernism, like okay, in the moment and in the current time, being my, also acknowledging what happened beforehand, like how do I regulate my own capacities and be aware of myself in the picture of what's happening with society? But this still doesn't separate the self from the other, or
Hmm.
this understanding of like the under this awareness of self with respect to our ecosystem and each other, right? Like there's still that problem even with Nietzsche's thinking and Hegel's thinking. Maybe
Well, yeah.
I think Hegel like around, like kind of sort of hit the what I would like to call the post meta modern. I think what's interesting about post meta modern is not thinking about just ourselves in how humanity play, how we as humanity play out for better or worse, but thinking about, okay, well, being mindful of like what can we do now and thinking steps ahead into the future about our like the repercussions of our actions and being more mindful and appreciative. I think that's the difference between the meta modern and the post-meta-modern perspective, is that the post-meta-modern perspective is more honest, and it's like we're glancing at the future, but we're not obsessing over it in an irrational sense, right? Like overthinking about ourselves in an egocentric or anthrocentric sense. But that's
Well,
I wanted to add that.
yeah, I do agree with what you're saying, but I think maybe I think like the point that the postmodern, maybe I'm wrong here. This is my own interpretation. This is what I've sort of discovered, is that the point that the postmodernists are making is that every single narrative that we construct about a developmental pattern, every single narrative that we construct about a development of something, truth, God, unity, consciousness, history, all of these things are are ego, not just they're all relative. They're all rooted in, yeah, it's all relative, I think. And what that means is not that, oh, well, there's a relational reality that we're all participating in. What it means is that every single direction we could take, every single perspective we could have is equal to every other perspective that exists. So the relationality of all possibilities are equivalent. And what that would say is that, okay, the model you created for this symbiotic relationship between the individual and the ecosystem, the self and the other, the unknowable other, and the development of the growing awareness of this relationship into a more harmonious interaction between man and the world that harbors him. Well, the postmodern would just say, well, that's your narrative. That's your narrative. And it's built on a presupposition that that's valuable. Why should I follow that narrative instead of, say, another narrative? And the reason I'm saying this is not because I disagree with you, but this because this is the argument that's posed. This is the postmodern perspective, and so this is sort of perspectivism. This is
Hmm.
sort of the idea that, well, and this is the thing. It's not necessarily the case that anyone actually adopts this view, because if anyone actually adopts this view, well, then they would say that, the model of living life is just as valuable is just as valuable as the model of not living, right? So it's like this pure relativism, this pure loss of the pure loss of like the will to life, you could say. Well, then what do we respond with? And so the reason, and this is why been having this antagonistic perspective to the rationality, is because I'm saying that this is the natural conclusion of the purely rational view, because the purely rational view would arrive at this idea of equality of all axiomatic systems, right? Whatever axiom we choose is equivalent to any other axiom that we could choose. And so every system is built on some faith presupposition. We maximize that, or we develop that in the parameters, the boundaries of the system that we've identified ourselves with. But ultimately, the idea that any system is worth pursuing more than any other system is our own hubris because the rationality would tell us, well, they're all equivalent. And so then there needs to be something irrational that is accepted, right? And that could exist as sort of, and this is where I agree with you because what you're saying really too is that there's an interracial, a sort of reciprocal relation between the particular and the individual and the collective, the organism, the superorganism, and that the only the recognition of these two th this reciprocality would allow us to exist in this way. But what I'm trying to inject into that is that there's another reciprocality that we must investigate and we must add is that the reciprocality between rationality and irrationality. Um, and this is what I meant when I talked about the Gnostic idea, the Kabbalistic idea, the alchemical idea of a union of opposites, right? That is represented in the Gospels with the union of man and God, right? The incompatible, the thing that is rationally incompatible. And so then, and this is where I asked if anyone was familiar with the idea of the union of opposites, because if you look at alchemy, if you look at Kabbalah, that actually has roots before Jesus, but if you look at Gnosticism, if you look at um, various forms of mysticism in all parts of the world, in the Eastern part, there seems to be a recognition of this idea of this union of opposites that exist, or this non-dualistic view. And I'm not trying to go it from like the super Alan Watts or the super, Rene Girard or the super Rene Guénon perspective of we have to have this purely Eastern perspective, but rather that what we have to have is a reciprocal relationship between the two. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if I was able to articulate myself well there.
I think that when we talk about axiomatic systems, like we have to consider like the context and the like how we like the rules of the system could be consistent with other systems. So I don't think you know, I don't think we can arbitrarily say that all axiomatic systems are equal. It's like, okay, like
Why can't we?
we can say that there are certain operations that can happen in one type of system that can't happen in another, but we can also consider that certain systems are kind of work across certain contexts. So
Yeah, but
like how
but but
interactions unravel too. So
but that would be working on the axiom that those systems being compatible or the conditions within them being similar is something valuable.
Mhm.
And that's an axiom in and of itself. Right. So then there's something you're trying to maximize. Oh, well, we want to
Mhm.
find the cross section or the a system of averages or whatever you want to call it. And
Mhm.
that's what I'm trying to push on.
Oh, well, I think that like, in terms of our base reasoning, like I think there's the base foundation is like where everything is similar, but then there's branching off of like you have different, axiomatic systems might vary in terms of like what operations can happen in one system as opposed to another because of where the branching off happens. So if the branching off is like, okay, like if you think of like a binary search tree, right, or like a
Hmm.
tree
Yeah.
diagram where things branch off, if they're under the same branch and they have like a primary branch that they relate to, then certain
Oh, yeah.
operations can be mapped to other operations. But if like that if they're in different parts of the tree that are unrelated, like if you think of even like how species are related, right, then there's not really much coherence
Okay.
on that level. But if you can reduce on a more base level to where there's compatibility there, and this is where there's problems with how humans can interact with other organisms, like or even like to the extent we can use language to talk to other animals, right? Like where there's problems with communicating with dolphins and orcas and chimpanzees, right? And like how they communicate with each other too. So like, um, but that's like kind of relating axiomatic systems to how agents, like different types of agents. But I think that's like the best way we could do, like we can put it is like, okay, on a base level, how does everybody interact with each other?
So what, okay, so then you would say that all systems share that base level, share that
Um,
same root? And if so, what is that root? And how do we, why is that the root of all systems?
yeah, if like so I try not to make this sound like entirely mathematical, but I think like if
Hmm.
we frame it in terms of the possibilities of cognition for different types of agents, then yes, not I would say even like the book by George Lakoff that I'm working through, where mathematics comes from, where it makes the case that okay, well, it seems like the capacities to reason about our environment, to explore, where we notice there are paths and there are things around us. Like we can account for what's in our environment, but in terms of like the how far of being able to abstract away our environment, right? Because we have the capacity to augment the language system that we have, which I would call true language as opposed to proto-language, right? So I would say other species of apes and even other mammals, like even like there's certain species of birds, or specific type of birds like corvids, so species of birds related to ravens and crows and seagulls, and they have this capacity to, you see similar behaviors in
Hmm.
humans, like other organisms, like just forming packs and like social dynamics. You see that, and that this is what you're getting. What is what I'm getting at with like what you're talking about, axiomatic systems, in the sense of, okay, how do different agents use their decision capacities, right, to align with others. I
Hmm.
think it's important to keep that in mind when
I
we're
see.
talking about truth. We're really talking about how agents are evaluating decisions. So, but I mean,
I
we
read,
could still call it an axiomatic system, but it would kind of be in the cognitive setting, I
I see.
would say.
I read a little bit on Lakoff and Nunez about the embodied cognition,
Hmm.
and that are the system of mathematics that we use as a consequence of the way that we cognitively interact with the environment.
Hmm.
Um, and so would you say that's a universal thing or a
Uh,
species thing?
That's a species thing, but like I said, like we have the tree, and even with with mathematics, like things branch away from set theory and category theory and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So you have different, you have this branching in mathematics too, but there's incompatibility of systems to communicate with each other, right? Or to where operations kind of like, you can perform a set of operations from one system and translate those operation systems to another system. Like sometimes we see this with computer systems, right? Like different types of distributions of computer systems, like with Linux and Windows, like for people who are programmers, right? Like, you and I have a bit of a programming background, but I'm terrible at programming. I understand computer science theory pretty well. I just, I can't think in code, so it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of a weird part of my life that I'm dealing with. Yeah, so like the base level of coherence, where species can kind of interact and understand like what's happening in their environment, and they kind of compromise to whatever degree that they can communicate their proto language or language to each other. But we end up communicating by proto language with other species, because they, even though we can like teach dogs how to do tricks and they can understand basic commands, for instance, right? And they understand certain phrases, and they can understand patterns and sequences and all that stuff, but they're not capable of harnessing language fluency abilities, right? And building on language, which is unique to humans. That's not necessarily saying that no other life will ever be able to develop this capacity humans have, but it could be
Okay.
different too. Like, there could be human-like intelligence out there that might not
Yeah.
even be able to interact with humans, right? Their axiomatic
Yeah.
system might not be compatible with ours, but that's kind of speculative. I don't really, I do kind of agree with you in a way that this capacity to reason, this axiomatic system foundation of reasoning, there's some similarity base level we can build on, but then it branches out. But
Okay.
yeah, I do
Well,
kind
then
of agree with you there.
the basis then for the development of our cognition is our interaction with the environment. Would that be proper to say?
Yes. And
So then,
and
but then there's a sort of very interesting dialogue to be had about the consequences of radically changing our environment in the last 200 years,
Okay.
right? Because if we look at the biblical stories, right, if we take this model to be true, then we could say that the biblical stories arise as a compatible as a method of perhaps the most compatible or efficient or optimal method, let's use optimal method of interacting with our environment. Given that we are humans, we exist in this sort of cognitive way, and then this is how we interact with the environment around us. But the world has changed a lot, even just the way that we, you know, cities and towns are millions of people. That's inconceivable. The way that's impacted the way that we interact with each other is drastic. If you look at technology, if you look at all these other things, well, then it becomes the question that I'm trying to get at then is that we now have the power to alter our environment. Therefore, the cognition and the way that we develop our method of interacting with the environment is developing side by side by that, right? So like a convergent evolution. Yet the sort of variable that is in there, or the changing variable, is that we can determine how to change our environment, right?
Yeah, I think that's in a way universal to all agents. So anything that has autonomy in an honest sense would be an agent, right? And like humans can't construct things that have the capacity to do that. What we can do is we can take organoid systems, like we can take samples of different animal cells and like put them together and try and set up mazes and these little games and tasks that the cell, like the homunculi cell structures can navigate, or we have organoid systems, which I guess you could call them like these homunculi cellular structures. And then we have like different variations of biobots like xenobots are like different species of frog cells. So, and basically like we're understanding that cells themselves are making these decisions, like they're able to explore their environment on their own, right? And so like humans, in a sense, like we're a whole ecosystem, but we're an
Yeah.
agent. Not every I think the problem with the Gaia hypothesis, and I wanted to kind of revisit the Gaia hypothesis, because what the Gaia hypothesis is saying is that every agent that exists is essentially embedded in an ecosystem, which serves and in a sense that each type of agent serves a specific role to regulate the co-inhabitants of other agents within the ecosystem that all are existentially bound to. So you have this prisoner's dilemma where all existing agents are competing and cooperating with each other, right? So there's cooperation and defect behaviors happening between
Hmm.
agents on different like levels and different time scales, right? And um, the problem with the Gaia hypothesis is assuming that the Earth itself is also alive alongside with everything else on it. And I think the proper reframe would be that, and this gets
Superorganism.
biblical. Yeah, it's still a superorganism like language, but it's not alive. It's the amalgamation of agents that, as a collective whole, form a whole
Yeah,
superorganism. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the superorganism itself is alive. It's this amalgamation of agents, like thinking of like, how like a corporation is a body of people
exactly.
working together, right? But with humans, it's kind of different
The
because
body
like
of the
we're
church, you might say.
the body has our bodies are a bunch of agents working together on different levels, different time scales. Um, but and this gets biblical in the sense of like all the different um analogies about how different species of animals have different roles. So like getting back to the Noah's Ark story, for instance, or even Adam and Eve, where they're naming all the animals in the garden, right? And these are just different areas in terms of biblical um referencing to more of the biblical analogies. I don't know the verses off the top of my head. I know these are in the Old Testament. Sorry, this is like around Genesis, mostly around Genesis, I would say. But
I would say
um,
there's a lot in the letters of Paul later in the gospel about the body of the church,
oh
um,
yeah.
about the various roles, the ears, the hands, the feet, right? Um, I would say you can also make a really good argument for the church being that superorganism, and the church being the body of all people as like interacting agents following a behavioral system.
Yeah, I was just while you were explaining that, I was trying to look for that verse about is it in Paul specifically or is it in another
I'll
book?
pull it up. Let me pull it up. Uh,
But I
okay.
think this is kind of like getting into speculating about
Yeah,
like
so
there's the actual physics of the universe's unraveling and interactions happening, right? And in
yeah.
the sense of understanding that, this doesn't really help us understand what God means. Like, but on the one hand, there's all these molecular interactions and subatomic interactions just happening and with emergent behavior on the one hand, and then
Here's a
that
good one. Yeah.
can that oh yeah, I'll let you
So
share it
there's
real quick.
two, Romans 12, for just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. And there's 1 Corinthians 12, for as the body is one and has many members, but all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we're all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and have all been made to drink into one Spirit. But I think the Romans 12 one is better, for these purposes.
Yeah. What I was saying, building on
Yeah,
okay, this is what makes the anthropic principle interesting because now we're thinking about what configuration does the universe have to be in for life to be possible? Knowing now that life is possible because we exist, okay, well, there's a lot of contention that the universe ever had a beginning. So we could say in some previous configuration of the universe, life happened in maybe a different way, and maybe there was human-like life. So we can say going back to a transition of prehistory and history of human-like life is the emergence of God, right? That God is always there, but God just kind of emerges into the picture. But I mean, um, okay, so there's problems with addressing existence arguments for God, and I think the best arguments are the teleological arguments, and I think active inference is a pretty good teleological argument for God because it's like, okay, well, we are agents and we have a conscience and we have to make decisions like we perceive and act on the world around us and we have to hold ourselves accountable and appreciate and in a way that appreciates ourselves and each other and the world while also being mindful of how we conduct ourselves. So it's like this is a nice teleological scope for active inference because it's like this goal directedness of how we align our behaviors with each other, and this gets into conscience. And conscience, the dynamics of conscience is all over the Bible. It like basically the Bible says, for the most part, God is the manifestation of unconditional love or goodness, or rather, this honest capacity for us to conduct our conscience or our will to act based on how we perceive the world around us at the same time. So and this is not just Christianity, by the way. This is common for most mainstream religions that okay, God, and this gets back to the sacred dynamic because you can't really know everything about God. So you get to God of the gaps, and then that relates to Gödel's incompleteness theorem indirectly, right? So it's you get all these interesting different things that relate
yeah,
to each other and paradoxes. But now I think there's an ontological incompleteness problem here, which I'm still trying to understand because, you know, a lot of people that believe in God, especially, are like, well, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, but we can use the anthropic principle to kind of say, well, if was never a beginning or end of the universe, then in some previous configuration, there was some kind of existing society on some galaxy far, far away, right? In some solar system, like that was like humans, and maybe they were far more sophisticated, right? And that possibility was the manifestation of God, and man is created in the image of God. Well, what is man? Man is just there's I feel like God is not a being of that it has a specific form that we can generalize, like because we're talking about meta reality, not just reality itself. So when we think about the physical interactions happening, like that's like the real that's like thinking about classical mechanics and quantum mechanics and relativity. And then we think about hyper reality, which is like, okay, the parameterizing, right? Like think about how Einstein said about what are these hidden variables? What's going on with hidden variables? Well, there's more parameters to account for, right? There's more dimensionality to consider that we're not generalizing enough. So over time, we unravel more parameters, we get more precise ways of navigating reality relate in relation to how we form consensus. So that's hyperreality. Hyperreality is the unraveling of these hidden variables, right? Like these constants that we hold in physics equations, right? Like the constant for the speed of light, like Planck's constant, and all this stuff, um, and Hooke's law, and all that. Like all those constants are a parameter that we don't really know yet, but we generalize what that parameter is. We okay, well we'll just hold this parameter constant because we don't know what it is. And then so that's dealing with hyper reality as opposed to the actual mechanics of reality. And then there's meta reality, and meta reality is well, things with metabolic capacity, not just hyperbolic. Like we're not just thinking about hyperbolic operations. We're thinking about things that have metabolisms, right? Like agents. Um, but yeah. So um, where was I going with that? Right. So God is not just meta reality, but when we think about how agents optimize their appreciation towards each other and how they conduct themselves, right? And this honestness, right? It sounds a bit cheesy after a while, I guess, the way I say it, but like God isn't just meta reality. God is a specific um, God is a specific unraveling of possibility states that are non-deterministic, that enable agents with human-like capacities to optimize their means to symbiotically coexist with other agents. So I feel like God basically is this capacity, right? Of like a variation of meta reality playing out for how specific types of agents that act like a second force of nature where they exist in a locality of space-time somewhere, right? But anyway, think I went on enough of a tangent there.
I think it was good though. The
Thank
God of
you.
the gaps.
Yeah. So omniscience will really just represents all configurations from pre-configured state of the universe before the Big Bang that happens, right? That we're the concept, we are the unraveling of the Big Bang that happened. What happened before the Big Bang, right? Well, something else happened. Maybe there was a meta reality that was playing out that happened before the Big Bang, but here we are where a meta reality happened, where life happened in our area of the cosmos. And that's basically God when that transition of for human, like, you have human-like agents transition from a period of prehistory to history in the way humanity has. And basically, that's the capacity for God, for the goodness of, and the optimal unravelings of interactions of these types of agents, and I think this is profoundly biblical. I'm not quite sure somebody could make that, what kind of argument somebody could make that would call me an atheist for saying these kind of things, like, oh, you're not a Christian. Well, I didn't call myself a Christian, but I'm okay with being deemed an honorary Christian because, I feel like I have a very radical perspective. But anyway.
I think it's part of like the new age spiritualism, I think. Like the I see you part of like the more so enlarging group of people that are realizing the compatibility between theology and philosophy, science. But like I said too, I think that there isn't as much of an open domain for maybe not open, but it's still something emergent. And I think like the reason I was doing all the postmodern stuff too is because that's a pushback you'll get from one side, right? The very, very scientific side, I think, and then or very, very secular side, and on the other side, you'll get a very traditionalist, dogmatic view. And so it's sort of finding that balance or finding not the middle ground really, but yeah, I don't want to say middle ground, but maybe like the interplay the
Yeah.
interplay. But it's difficult. It's very, very difficult actually. Um, I've struggled a lot actually, in conversations with people in trying to find any sort of middle ground and trying to find any sort of
So here's one thing that I'm still struggling with wrapping my head around. For those, so I don't know if you're all familiar with Donald Hoffman. He's really into reality as an interface, or reality's really, well, he's kind of, I don't entirely agree with his take that reality is an illusion. It's like, like what how we I think what he's the
like
argument
the
he's
real and the
trying to make,
hyperreal.
the argument he's trying to make is that, like, is pretty strong in the philosophy of science literature that's kind of not taken, we don't take it for granted enough, is that we can always generalize our reality where we form consensus narratives, but we can never really justify
Hmm.
this is the way we experience reality is reality. It's like, well, we can only know reality based on the limitations of our capacity to
Hmm.
perceive it in the first place. So I think this is a really strong stance from the cognitive point of view, like a cognitive realism, like realizing that there's limitations and comprehension of agents in general, and that um, it's kind of like the halting problem of agency, is that, like, these indeterminate these moments of indeterminacy. And like I said, like, there's a difference between indeterminacy as opposed to non-determinacy, where non-determinacy is like, okay, there's choices that where in how we conduct ourselves or how interactions happen. We don't know the outcome in the future until something happens, and then we can reduce those things that happen into a chain of deterministic outcomes. So the non-determinism is like, if is the collapsing of like the collapsing moment of the non-determinism is the determinism, right? So the universe is, as the history of the universe is deterministic, but the future of the universe is non-deterministic largely, right? And then we still don't understand stuff like dark matter because, well, I mean, there's arguments saying that Planck's constant is dark matter, and we don't, all the arguments for dark matter and dark energy is like, okay, stuff that we can't really detect well with the technology we have, and behaviors happening out deep in the cosmos, and stuff around black hole formations and star clusters. And we're seeing a lot of this weird behavior from that, where there's this gets into the problems of quantum mechanics and relativity, because quantum mechanics has a lot to do with the subatomic um, the subatomic deformations of space-time, as opposed to the more macro level interactions happening at space-time at high energy capacities, right? So high energy physics is largely like understanding how planets move around solar, like, a planet moves around a star, and then, you have a bunch, you have layers of planets that orbit around a star, and then stars orbit, star systems orbit around each other, and then you have all these spiral, geometries as a result, because you have a black hole in the center of them, and eventually those things get sucked into the black hole. We still don't know what's going on with black holes, but that's going on a tangent. Where was I going with that? That was interesting. Um, yeah, I don't know where exactly I was going with that. But can you finish your thought? I'm sorry.
Me?
Yeah.
I forgot the thought. I don't even know where I was.
Okay. Well, um,
I don't know where I
oh,
was.
anyway,
Where
oh,
was
right,
I?
the anthropic principle. Where there? Okay. Well, um, there's no, like, okay, well, here's something interesting. The universe is expanding at an accelerated rate, which we can't really predict. So it's not like necessarily an exponential rate. It's not a linear rate. Like, it's just like the distance in which space is occupied by anything that exists in the universe is just pushing outward, and there's no form. There's no way we can generalize the form in which it's pushing out into, if that makes sense. Like, some physicists have said, oh, well, the universe looks like a donut, but that's really just a generalization of electrodynamic interactions, which a lot of the interactions we see with our eyes is pretty much basically electric, the electromagnetic weak and strong forces, like that's mostly like a lot of most of the interactions that are happening um, are like that. So that became a generalization of like, okay, the universe is a donut shape. But then this extends to, well, can we generalize the form of what God is? And like, is God a being? And then I think that gets us back to what the anthropic art principle really represents here is, when we're thinking about configure all possible configurable states, which that goes beyond perceivable human comprehension, right? We like, not we can make as many generalizations as we want, no matter how convincing they sound to us within our lifetimes, right? And then in the future, within the lifetimes of other humans, they'll make generalizations that are more interesting than ours, but we'll never have a complete understanding of reality, right? And like, in a sense, this poetically aligns with Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but also, like, I think this gets into the beauty of appreciating God, because there's no simplistic way in which we can optimally engage with each other in a way that we appreciate one another and the world around us. Like, there's no way we can just simplistically sugarcoat and generalize this, right? There, like, we like most of what happens, like most of like most of the time, like, when we make predictions, even in science, like, even like over 5 years into the future, there's so much uncertainty, in terms of like where the economy's going. So it's like, when we're at our worst and we don't know what's going to happen, and we're wrestling with existence, most of us are becoming existentialists because of that. And when we're at that moment, it's like, I'm not calling it blind faith, but we become hopeful and optimistic about, okay, well, what can I do best with my time? And how can I best relate to others and have an impact on my community? And it's every possible moment that not just me and you try and optimize for that circumstance, like just how we align ourselves, but even like thinking about what happened before the Big Bang. Was there life before, what was life like before this current configuration of the universe unraveled from the Big Bang as we understand it? And like maybe there was a Big Bang in the past or some cosmological event in the past of the universe, right? And then meta reality emerged and unraveled in the sense that basically, you have you have some civilization on some planet far, far away in a galaxy somewhere, in some solar system that far, far away. It sounds a lot like Star Wars, I know, but it's just like this is not something that scientists can say, "Oh, this is absurd." But like this is an argument we can make about omnipotence, I think, or omniscience. Is like if we were to if we were to say like, "Oh, what like how do we have a serious conversation about, well, it's one thing to talk about how we all have a conscience, and a lot of what it means to believe in God means like how we conduct ourselves. Well, what does it mean like when we see verses in the Bible that talk about omnipotence and omniscience? It's the fact that it's impossible to understand the formation of all possibilities that can happen in which we conduct ourselves in a way in which we have this conscience awareness and this formation of consensus narratives, right? So I think that's like really I think that's really the beauty of of making arguments for God. Is like, okay, the ontological argument, the ontology is incomplete because there's no end to the universe, right? There's always some possibility, even like when all humans die, like when our area of the cosmos is consumed by a black hole, like because there's a black hole at the center of our own solar system, right? In some configuration later, life could happen somewhere else in the cosmos, and it can be human-like. And then those agents are going to have the same issues. And omniscience or omnipotence has to do with all possible ways that are beyond our own possibility to even perceive and conceive. It's like we can come up with so many possibilities, but we can't come up with all possibilities. So that's the real argument for saying, okay, this is the argument for omnipotence or omniscience. So hopefully I'm making sense of that. It's like this is how we can appreciate the ontological argument, acknowledging that the ontology is incomplete, or making some kind of argument that it's incomplete, but also appreciating it, if that makes sense. That's the end of my rant. But but yeah, I think that's definitely from even the atheistic point of view. It's like, what is this omniscience and this omnipotence nonsense? Like, what is this? It's like, okay, well, let's think deeply about physics, like the anthropic principle, right? It's like, oh, okay, here's a really strong apologetics behind this. And I think, a lot of that's missing in current theological understandings too. It's like, oh, how do we address this argument? So that's and I think that's a pretty do you guys agree with that, or what do you guys think?
I don't know if Casney has anything to say, um, but um, I gotta think some more on it. I'm gonna be honest. I gotta digest some more. Um, my head's
No,
still on
I
some other stuff.
understand. Yeah,
That's not a
good.
good answer. It's like, oh yeah, but it's no, I need to do some more digestion because you that was a very long tangent as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah. Well, do you have any questions about anything I said? Or I'm curious about what Kasny thinks, even if he's like, oh, like, you know, but this sounds interesting, but it's like I need some time to think about it. But like,
Well, you should
um,
write some of the parts of it out too. I'm going to be honest.
oh yeah, yeah,
It
yeah,
seems like you've gotten a sophisticated model
yeah.
with the
I'm
anthropomorphic
trying
and the
to,
symbolic, the symbiotic relation and all
yeah.
those things. So that's what I think, really.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. I'm definitely, well, that's going to probably be maybe the next preprint I'm going to put out on I use Zenodo, but I'm trying to work my way towards that with the model. I'm trying to model like game theoretic dynamics of how agents interact with each other and thinking about like this prisoner's dilemma situation where it's like, oh, wait, it's not all of us against ourselves, but like we have to kind of compete and coordinate at the same time, like not compete to the point where we're just deceiving each other, but it's kind of like, okay, like how do I bargain with you like as another agent? Like what are certain ways we can bargain with each other? So that's one way of thinking about it, that like in terms of like, okay, well, like how is this playing out? And also on the compositional sense of like, okay, well, how do we categorize this, and how do we evaluate the behavior? How do we identify different patterns um in terms of how agents are interacting with each other? So on the one hand, uh you have kind of you kind of have how you have like the agents interacting with each other in a dynamic of cooperation and deception, right? Sometimes they deceive each other, other times they cooperate. On the one hand, on the other hand, uh, you have agents. You have like kind of like their epistemology and like like how like the nature versus nurture attitude of each singular agent within a dynamic of other existing agents, and also the groups, like the groupings of agents and um their care, like understanding, like thinking about belief systems and world modeling, like but yeah, that's that paper that I'm working on right now is hopefully going to lead into hopefully what is going to be what I call a cognitive theology focused paper, where I get into a model like that, and eventually what I want to do um is kind of do like a cross comparison between, okay, how do we compare Christian principles to, like, how do we compare the Bible to the Quran, and like the Bible to the Torah, and the Talmud, right? So the Talmud being a lot of the commentary about Christianity and talking about the Messiah. What does the Messiah represent? And I think that we can have an interfaith and a transfaith dialogue among Jews and Christians, like especially like Jews that are very stern on like not agreeing on what the Messiah represents. But I think that, like, maybe you also agree. I'm not sure if I addressed this with you, that the Messiah represents kind of like how individuals and groups of agents may carry themselves, and like whether or not it's like that the instances of cooperation and deception that unravel, right? That the Messiah represents like an agent learning it from its mistakes and then like reinventing itself. Like there's this deepness that the Messiah represents, like real not necessarily idealizing like the potential of agency, but like thinking about like what does it mean that we're suffering, like, and thinking about how that means that we're all carrying a cross on our backs, right? It gets really deep like that. um and I think there's a conversation to be had there, um in and especially in different denominations of Judaism, where we can talk about what does it mean to have a grounded lifestyle? Like, what kind of values matter to me? What should I really, I think Judaism as opposed to Christianity uh really prioritizes self-discipline in a sense of having this groundedness that I think I see missing a lot of. I see that missing from a lot of people that call themselves Christian. Like they're really like, when I talk to people from synagogue communities, and I talk to people that are like, are Orthodox Jewish, or they're Reformed or whatnot. It's like they're really, they take life seriously in a way that sometimes is like a bit neurotic, I will say. And and I'm being somebody, being an individual with neurodivergence, a neurodivergent person. I have my neurotic moments, but I think it's like, you know but there's this appreciation for having this groundedness and holding oneself accountable. And I think that's one thing I really appreciate in the Jewish community more so in the Christian community, is that, and maybe I don't get to meet much people, and many, I don't get to meet many Muslims, so it's hard for me to really. I wish, hopefully maybe we get some people that can speak about what it means to follow the five pillars. What does that mean? Because I don't get to have that conversation. Really, it's unfortunate, and I think that Islam and Judaism are very similar. That there's this focus on groundedness and discipline, but you know, I, it's easier to have that conversation in the Jewish community as opposed to the Muslim community, because there's not as many people in my immediate community or my own circle that I know that are Muslim that I can have that conversation with. It's like, what does it mean to have a grounded lifestyle? What does God mean to you? Like, what does the Messiah mean? What does it mean to be a person and to have priorities in life? And what does it mean to what is God's plan? What does that mean, right? But yeah, if that makes sense.
That does a lot of topics there to get into.
Hmm.
I actually do want to talk about the conceptions, the groundedness that you talk about in Judaism,
Hmm.
particularly Reform Judaism. I mean, the point, it's a point that should be made is that the pillar that Reform is built on is ethics, right? Scripture is replaced by ethics
Hmm.
for Reform, and a lot of the Reform branches. And you can see humanistic Judaism as well, and they deal a lot more with the conceptions of ethics, morality, rather than dogmatic, literal interpretation of Scripture. But you also see that strong discipline, and you are right that there's a big similarity between Judaism and Islam, and the reason is because it all comes back down to the Messiah. So I think there could be a long conversation there. Unfortunately, I think it would be better to save that for next time, for, at least for me
Sure.
personally, because I think those are some great ideas to get into. I have a lot to say about the ideas of the Messiah, and I think that's like that's the one point you can really draw a delineating image of the three monotheistic religions in the West. Um, but another topic that necessarily leads into that's very interesting is as well, okay, there are the literal interpretations of what this means, but what are the mystical interpretations? Because from the literal perspective, there is no room for trans faith, right? Or interfaith. There isn't, unfortunately. It's only from a more mystical perspective that you can begin to find alignment or common ground, right? Uh, and that's both fortunate and unfortunate, I would say.
Oh, one thing I wanted to say, like in differing between, like contrasting between interfaith and transfaith, I think interfaith is like having an interfaith dialogue as opposed to a transfaith. I consider this to be a transfaith dialogue where not only are we talking about our beliefs, but we're trying to form a consensus around those beliefs, right? We're trying to see like how we relate to each other and then build on that. But the problem with interfaith is like, okay, like I'll agree to disagree with you here, but I don't want to form consensus. Oh, this sounds interesting, but maybe because of like the way, I think it's like the upbringing and like the demeanor of the person too. Like whether you're going to have an interfaith as opposed to a transfaith dialogue. I think and sometimes you can't have either, but but with with an interfaith dialogue, it's like, okay, we're going to have a conversation, but we're not going to decide to group together. We still decide to, um, there's this idea of collaboration that I think really that's the bridge between interfaith and transfaith is that there's this collaborative dialogos I guess you could put together is that okay, let's say somebody of Jewish, somebody who's like okay, I identify myself as Jewish, and then another person's like okay, I identify myself as a Christian. They might stick to identifying as what they are, but they'll kind of work together and having a consensus belief system, right? So that's the transfaith dialogue. The interfaith dialogue is kind of like, okay, these are my values, these are your values. We'll meet where we're at, and we might, but we won't form a consensus dialogue on our
Well,
spiritual beliefs, right? But that
that's
doesn't necessarily mean that we can't coexist. I think that's a bit different,
that's
right? Like,
but that's the point of distinction. The interfaith dialogue already has an underlying model that's held true.
hmm
And that's the liberal model, that we should be open to differing ideas
hmm
insofar as those ideas are open to us.
Yeah.
That's the idea underneath. So that's already accepted as the model, as the ultimate objective model of interaction between people of different faiths. The adherence
hmm
to the overlying model of liberalism, right? But the trans faith method would be more so rooted in spirituality,
hmm
religious ideas, and more political ideas.
Yeah, it's
Because
like you're forming
because you
consensus.
might say like you'll have these people that come together like, oh, this is what I think and this is what I think. We'll agree to disagree. But overlying that is the concept of it's okay to agree to disagree because we already adhere to a different model, right? And so what I
hmm
would say is that
That's the trans-faith dialogue there, when you both are forming a different model
yes,
alongside the
exactly,
models you have. You don't just
exactly,
give up the model that you had in the beginning, but you augment that with this
exactly, yeah,
collaborative model. Yeah.
exactly. And
But the
so in the
interfaith
inner,
dialogue is
yeah,
just
there
you're
is no
not
attempt to
doing that.
augment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But you could still
yeah.
work together. You still have, you still have
It
values
may.
that complement each other, but it's not really going to have that spiritual impact.
The
So,
benefit of the interfaith dialogue is that it might lead to a transfaith dialogue.
yes. And
Right.
then the failure of either is just, like it's like, oh, I don't agree with your values, you don't agree with mine. Let's just, draw the line there. Like
Yeah.
that's the difference. But the interfaith dialogue is like, okay, well, we can coexist, we can work together, but our belief systems, there's no augmentation. And um, it's hard to say when that is and isn't necessary. I think like if you're, let's say like you're working with somebody in a business, right? An interfaith dialogue, interfaith interaction is like you're working with somebody doing something that hasn't doesn't have anything to do with your spiritual or belief system based values, right? Like if what you're doing isn't really directly associated with your beliefs, like then it's like you guys are just kind of working towards a means to an end. But the trans faith dialogue is like, okay, we have our own different separate belief systems, but now we also have a connected beliefs. We're forming on this connected belief system, right? So,
Yeah.
but I think that's a little tricky because that's kind of like if you're part of a community, like an organization that is committed to like an effort that has certain beliefs about how the environment should be, like you're an environmentalist or something and you're really into like, oh, like we need more greenhouses in the community, like we can talk about trans faith dialogue without really making it specifically about religion, but it's like, okay, I have this belief that we should work together in a certain capacity that has these values that are augmented, right? So that's kind of trans faith where, you know, interfaith, if we're thinking about a way that's also kind of secular, like we have this secular boundary where it's like, okay, like how can somebody who's an atheist and somebody who's not an atheist appreciate what interfaith and transfaith dialogue means? But the transfaith dialogue is like, you know, you're part of a movement or you're affiliated with like, okay, this is what we should work towards, like, and it's like, there's really abstract values associated with that are deep, right? That's where the trans faith comes in. But an interfaith is like, well, it's not that deep, but there's still a cooperation there, but it's not really deep. It's like at a surface level. So that, I guess, does that make sense? I just want to make sure that's those are the points I was making about
Yeah,
the difference
that makes
between
sense to
interfaith
me.
and trans faith, uh, in terms of like dialogue and interaction, like the level of depth. Um, but
No, I
yeah,
agree. I agree. I agree.
yeah, cool. Hey, we've been on for about 2.5 hours, or about 2 hours almost. So I wasn't sure if Kazni had anything to say, but I know it's getting later, and maybe we can wrap it up.
Yeah, I think it's pretty late for him.
Yeah, it's like 2 a.m.,
Oh, yeah.
about to be
Okay.
3.
That's
Yeah.
fair. All right. Well, I think we had a pretty interesting discussion tonight, and the next session is going to be on the 12th, I believe, of December. So, but I'll keep you guys updated about that, and we'll build on a lot of the points we made here that we want to keep going, we keep building on, like in terms of relational truth and trans faith as opposed to interfaith dialogues, and
And the
yeah,
idea of the Messiah. I
yes,
think,
absolutely.
I agree. That's gonna be great. I'm looking forward to it. All right, well, thank you, Jesse. It was nice to meet you as well, Kazni. I hope you get a good night's rest. Hope you enjoy France as well. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna head out. I'll talk to you guys next time. I'll
Next.
keep tabs with you, Jesse.
Yes.
Um,
It was a
all right.
pleasure. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. See you guys.
See ya.